So we have 2 more lectures, and then I will invite the speakers up to a panel, and they'll take questions from the audience. Our next speaker is Professor Ayal Kimhi from the Taub Center and also from the Hebrew University. He will be talking about employment and wage gaps in the Israeli economy.
Okay, thank you all for coming. So my name is Ayal Kimhi. I'm the Deputy Director of the Taub Center in Jerusalem. It's the first time that I have to say which Taub Center I'm talking about. And I'm also from the Hebrew University. I'm also heading the labor policy program at the Taub Center. And what we have done in the last 2.5 years that I've been there is mostly discussing labor market issues such as employment, wage inequality, access to good jobs by different population groups, and I'm going to show you some key results in these fields. Most of what I'm going to show today is going to be in the next annual report of the Taub Center. It's going to be mostly graphical, and I hope you'll be able to follow the graphs that I'm going to show you. I'm not going to go into the fine details because there are plenty of those. So let me just start. And I'm going to focus, the title of the talk is The Role of Education, because it turns out that education is the key issue. So that's the bottom line. The bottom line is education can account for most of the gaps in employment and wages. But let me convince you that this is the case. So first of all, let me show you the growth of inequality. Is just as Iran mentioned, I'm showing the Gini coefficient. Doesn't really matter. It has to be between 0 and 1. And the most important thing is that it's been rising in Israel over the last 30 years with perhaps some modest decline in recent years. This is in terms of gross income. So this is before government intervenes in terms of taxes and transfers. What happens when the government intervenes? Well, obviously it's able to lower inequality. So if you look at inequality after the government intervention, it's much lower. The government has been able to take about 10 points off the Gini in 1979, 14 points off the Gini in 1990, and 16 points off the Gini in 2000. Of course, this has budgetary implication. This costs a lot of money. But the bottom line is that the net Gini, or the inequality in net income has not been rising as fast as gross income. But this was only true until 2000, because since then, the government pulled out of some of those welfare programs, and inequality in net income actually increased even faster. So to put this in international perspective, Iran also already mentioned that, but Israel is at the top of the income distribution, of income inequality rankings of the OECD countries. It's slightly below the US. It was so in 2005, but still very high compared to other advanced countries. And another measure of inequality is the gap between the higher and the lower deciles of the income distribution. And this graph is published by the OECD a few months ago, showing the gaps of the growth rates of the income of the higher and lower deciles of the income distribution. So you can see that in Israel, the gaps are increasing much, much faster than in any other country in the OECD. So we do have a problem of inequality in Israel. It's rising over time, and it's already quite high in international terms. So I'm going to talk about the sources of this income inequality, because if we think about remedies, we cannot think about remedies unless we understand the sources quite correctly. So I'm going to start. So the first thing that comes to mind is capital income, because we know that capital income is very highly unequally distributed. However, we don't know much about capital income and how it is generated, how it is distributed. The statistics are not very good at that, so I'm going to skip that and move straight to labor income. And labor income consists about 75% of the income of the average household in Israel. So if we trace the sources of labor income inequality, that will explain probably much of what is there to be explained in terms of total income inequality. And when we speak about labor income, we'll speak about, I'm going to speak about 3 different factors that generate labor income. First of all, do you work or not? That's the first element in generating labor income. The second is, if you work, how much do you work? Do you work full-time? Do you work part-time? How many hours per week? And the third, of course, is the wage rate. If you have a good job, you get well paid or not. And these 3 factors together generate the labor market, labor income distribution. So I'm going to focus on those 3 one after the other. So first of all, look at employment rates. And comparing to the OECD, we can see, first of all, that the employment rates of males in OECD countries have been declining from slightly over 90% 30 years ago to about 85, 86% today. This is common in many advanced countries. In Israel, the employment rates of men was not much lower than the OECD 30 years ago, but it has been declining faster than in the OECD, with some exception in the last years in which it's been rising slightly and closing the gaps, but still employment of males in Israel is lower, much lower than in OECD countries. And Iran mentioned the unemployment rate, which is quite low, but unemployment only measures the fraction of people who are looking for jobs and not finding jobs. In Israel, the problem is that there are many people who are not even looking for jobs. So this is for males. For females, the OECD females have been working more and more over the years. And Israeli women actually started with employment rates below the OECD levels 30 years ago, but they've been catching up and even surpassing the employment rates in OECD. So our women are doing pretty well in the labor market, not only in the labor market, in case my wife is around. So to go into a little bit more details, so I'm going to look at the employment rates of different population subgroups, and the main population subgroups that I'm going to look at are the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, I'm using the Hebrew expression, the Arab population, and then the rest of the economy. And the rest of the economy, of course, is still the majority. So you can see that the Arabs are working less than the non-Haredi population, and the Haredi men are working much less even than the Arabs, and the rates have been declining and declining even faster for the weakest population subgroups. So if the Haredim, for example, have been employed, over 70% of them were employed 30 years ago, and now it's below 50%. We see some improvement in the last few years, especially for the Arabs and the Haredim. The Haredim, it's only 2 years improvement in employment rates. We're not sure it's sustainable. We're not sure it's continuing the next few years. We'll have to see about that. What about females? Again, the OECD female labor force participation has been on the rise. And in Israel, it's also been on the rise for all these population subgroups. Employment of non-Haredi Jewish women have been rising from 50% 30 years ago to 80% these days. The Arab women have been increasing from about 5% to 35%, which is quite dramatic. And the Haredi women have been also working a little bit more, but not as much as the other population subgroups. The rise has been more modest. Now, when we look at changes in employment rates over a period of 30 years, we have to take into account that the population is changing. It's not the same people over the years. We have the older people going out of the labor force and younger people coming in the labor force, and those people are different. They have different, for example, levels of education. The older people who are leaving the labor market are much less educated than the younger people who are coming into the labor market. So what I'm going to do in order to control for these changes is to look at cohorts, to look at birth cohorts, and to see how their employment rates are changing over cohorts and over time. So in order to give you a one-dimensional look at these changes, I'm going to focus on age 44, which is about the top of the employment probability for almost all cohorts. And I'm going to show you how the employment rates are changing when the new cohorts are coming into the labor market. So for example, for those born during the 1930s, over 90% of the males were employed and less than 50% of the females were employed. And when you go to younger cohorts, the male employment rate is declining, the female employment rate is rising, and that's true for all those cohorts. So that's similar to what we've seen in the overall statistics. Now let's break it down by population subgroups and look at males first. Then you can see that the Arabs are working less than the non-Haredi Jews. The Haredi Jews are working less than the Arabs, but still, among those born in the 1930s, about 80% of the Haredim were working at age 44. What happens when we move to younger cohorts? All these population groups are working less, but see the dramatic decline in the employment rates of the Haredim from 80% to 50% within 1 decade. Okay? Again, the trend continues with a very sharp decline of the employment rate of Haredim and a somewhat lower decline in the, among the Arabs and the non-Haredim. What about females? Among those born in the 1930s, very few of the Arab women were employed, and this has been increasing in all population groups over the cohorts, the new cohorts. Still, the Haredi women, as I said before, are working more than 30 years ago, but not as much as the other population subgroups. So now let's focus on one cohort and see how employment rates are changing by age and by the level of education. So I'm focusing here on those born in the 1940s, and I'm starting with men with more than 12 years of schooling. And looking at their employment rates over the range of ages 34 to 54, which is the main employment rate, you see that the employment rate has been more or less constant around 90% until age 50 or so, and then it starts declining. What happens to less educated males? Those with no more than 12 years of schooling had about the same employment rates in the younger ages, but somehow they've been declining since the age of 38, and the gap between the more educated and the less educated has been increasing over the years. It seems like the less educated people are losing jobs and unable to find new ones compared to the more educated males. What happens with respect to, in the case of females? Females with more than 12 years of schooling have seen rising employment rates until about age 50. That's probably because the kids are growing and leaving home, and then women have more time to go into the labor market. The employment rates are lower among the more educated than those of the similar more educated male, but not as much lower as in the entire population. Why? Because if you look at less educated females, those with no more than 12 years of schooling, you see that their employment rates are much, much, much lower. So the gap between the more educated and less educated females is probably the dominating figure here. And if you think about the fact that, that I've shown you that the employment rates of females have been rising overall, then if you take out education, you see no difference. So the whole rise in female employment rate in Israel is due to the fact that the younger females coming into the labor market are more educated than the older females that are leaving. So education accounts for almost all of the gap among the females, a little bit less than that among the males. Let's break this down into these population subgroups. This time I'm going to look at the later cohort of those born in the 1950s. I have some personal affiliation with this cohort. Again, looking at men and those, and I'm going to show only those for the statistics for those with more than 12 years of schooling to start with. So among the men, you see that employment rates, non-Haredi Jews have been around, coming to around 90%. The Arabs have been even higher than that, but I don't know if that's statistically different. We're talking about a small population subgroup, but still the Arab employment rates have been declining faster than those of the non-Haredi Jews. So in that sense, the educated Arabs behave somewhat similar to the uneducated Jews, in a sense. And among the Haredim, according to our definition of Haredim, they all have more than 12 years of schooling, of course, the yeshiva education. And we see that their employment rates are much lower. They're also rising with age as they kind of drop out of the yeshiva and join the labor market, but still much lower than the rest of the economy. How about women? You see that the employment rates of educated non-Haredi women, Jewish women, have been, again, slightly lower than that of males, but not that much lower as you expect. The Arabs have seen employment rates that are lower than the Jews, but not as much lower as you see from the overall statistics. So for the Arab women who are able to get higher education, they're also able to find jobs. I'm not saying it's the best jobs around, but they are able to find jobs. So moving now to those with no more than 12 years of schooling, then you can see that the gaps between the Jews and the Arabs are now widening even faster than among the educated. So the Arabs as a whole lose employment over the years, and it's more severe for the less educated Arabs. With respect to males, you see that the employment rates of the Jews, Jewish females are around 60% tops, and the Arabs, non-educated females, it's around 10%. So again, the gap between the Arab educated and not-educated women is dramatic. So the increase of education of Arab females is really the main and almost the only factor that is able to increase the participation rates of Arab women in Israel. And so just to give you this from a slightly different perspective, I forgot the Haredi women. I put them among the lower educated because it's just a small group. We cannot divide them into two groups statistically, but still the employment rates are lower than the non-Haredi Jews and higher than the Arabs. So just comparing the educated, not-educated among the Jews, non-Haredi Jews and the Arabs, it's the same things I showed you before, but just to put this in a different perspective. Among those with more, the difference between those with more than 12 years of schooling and those with no more than 12 years of schooling, at the age of 30, it's about the same, but then the less educated are not able to maintain their jobs and their employment rates are lower. Among the women, we see that the difference is much more dramatic. That's among the Jewish population. And then among the Arabs, again, those with more than 12 years of schooling, those with up to 12 years of schooling, no more. Again, the gap is more dramatic than among the Jewish population, and especially so for the Arab women. So education is key here. It's key especially for women, but also for males. As the males age, the less educated are losing their jobs, not able to find new ones, and the more educated are somehow able to remain in the labor market. So that's about employment rates. Let's talk about how much people work. And these are the average weekly hours of work of those who work. So it doesn't include those who are not working. So these average hours of work are actually higher than in most other advanced countries, but they have been declining over the years. And they have been lower in the among the Arab population, and even lower among the Haredim. And you can see that these are the main that I'm showing you at this point. And you see that the main difference here is over the years is within the Haredi population. And the Haredim, not only their employment rates are so low, they're also working fewer hours per week, so they're working more part-time jobs. And this part-time employment is even increasing in importance between 1998 and 2009. What happens in the case of females? Well, they work fewer hours than males. The non-Haredi Jewish women have actually increased their average hours of work, and the Haredi women are working much less than that. Obviously, they have so many kids at home to take care of, they cannot work full-time. But you can see the major decline in the length of the work week for the Arab women, and that's partly because those women who were able to find jobs that I showed you before, probably were able to find part-time jobs initially, and so the average working week has been declining for the Arab women. So that's the second element of the income distribution that I want to show, the weekly work hours. And now we're going to move to wages. And first I want to give you a perspective on how unequally the wages in Israel are distributed. I'm going to look at a statistic that's called the 1910 wage differential. So it's the, if you order the workers from the lowest to the highest wage, you take the ratio of the worker that is in the 19th percentile position and divide it by the wage of the worker at the 10th percentile position. And when you compare this internationally, you can see that at the bottom of the list you have the Scandinavian countries, and at the top of the list you have the United States, but then even higher than that, Israel. So Israel is now the OECD leader in wage gaps between the 90th and 10th percentile, which is not a position that we'd like to maintain, but it's been like that for at least since 1998 when we have good data to compare. So it's not only the income in Israel is very highly unequally distributed, it's only the way, even if you take out capital income and you take out the income of the self-employed, you still end up with a very highly high inequality in the wage distribution. So let's try to go into the wages and how they are distributed within the population by looking at some statistics. First of all, the hourly wage, the gross hourly wage in Israel has increased by about 3% from 1998 to 2010. That's not much. Over 12 years or 13 years of time, that's not much. And especially if you compare it to the growth rate of the economy, which was about 20%. So it turns out that the wage employees have been enjoying only a very little chunk of the overall growth in Israel. So you can imagine which other sections of the economy, segments of the economy have been enjoying even more than what hired employees were able to enjoy. If you compare males and females, you see that the growth of wages of males and females have been not exactly the same, but also not very different. So the gap between males and females has been slightly rising over the last 12 years, but not that much. And still the difference between the male and female wages they do exist. They are in the order of magnitude of 15%, 20%. That's not the big thing here. The big thing is education. When you compare the wages of the more educated and less educated workers, you see a difference of about 66%. I think, so the average person with more than 12 years of schooling makes 2/3 more than the average worker with not more than 12 years of schooling. And I think these gaps is about similar to what you see in the US, the gaps between college graduates and non-college graduates. So maybe it's not unique to Israel, but still this is the dominant gap. It's much higher than the male-female wage differential, and it's sustainable over the years. It doesn't change much. So what it means, to give some interpretation of this, we know that the number of educated people in Israel has been on the rise. So if you think about this as a demand and supply framework, and you would expect that the wages of the more educated are going to be going to decline compared to the wages of the less educated, because there are more educated workers in the labor market and less non-educated workers. But the gaps do not change over time, which means that the demand is also changing. So the modern labor market is now requiring more and more education, and therefore the wage differential between the educated and the less educated is maintained, is not changing over time. Comparing men and women in this sense, you see that the educational wage gaps are higher among the men, but that's mostly because the more educated men are making much more than the more educated women. We know a little bit more about why this is so, and I'll try to give you some intuitive explanation to this in the next few slides that I'm going to show. So first of all, to see what happened in the Israeli labor market over those years, there are two major changes. Here I'm going to show the occupational distribution of the labor market, and what you can see is that the fraction of managerial and academic positions in the Israeli labor market has been increasing significantly over the last 12 years, whereas at the same time, the fraction of skilled and unskilled jobs have been declining. So it's kind of white collar and blue collar jobs are being changing positions here. So there's more demand for academics, more demand for educated worker, and less demand for the those who are providing the unskilled employment. So to compare these occupations, I'm going to compare them in several different dimensions. First of all, there is a big educational gradients among these occupations. You have the academic positions who have about 90% of their employees are educated, and you have on the other side of the spectrum, you have the skilled and unskilled workers with about a quarter of the workers who are educated. So most of the educated workers go to the white collar jobs, and most of the non-educated workers go to the blue collar jobs. Now, one exception here is in the middle. You see the clerical workers, that the rate of, or the fraction of educated workers has been rising more dramatically than in other occupations, and let's keep that in mind, and I'll show you some further statistics that will make sense perhaps. So when you look at the wages in these occupations, you see that the two outstanding occupations in which the wage increases were more dramatic than in the others. One was the clerical workers, and that makes sense because we've seen that there are more educated clerical workers, so it makes sense that they'll earn more. But on the other hand, we have the skilled and unskilled workers that also saw a similar or even higher wage increase without much changes in the distribution of educated and non-educated workers. So this is a puzzle that we need more information to try to sort it out. So in order to sort it out, I'm going to look at the changes in the wages by education. So first of all, I'm going to look at those with no more than 12 years of schooling and see that basically there's about the same rate of wage increase over the years. There's not much difference between the different occupations. These are the wages of the non-educated or the less educated workers. What about the wages of the more educated workers? Here we see that those two occupations that stood out before are even more dramatic. We see higher wages among the educated clerical workers and even much higher, 30% rise on the wages of the educated skilled and unskilled workers. So how can you explain this, again, based on an equilibrium between supply of educated workers and demand for educated workers in the economy? Perhaps we can understand a little bit more of that if you look at the gender composition of these jobs. We can see that, again, these two occupations stand out in two different extremes of the distribution. The clerical workers are mostly females, while the skilled and unskilled workers are mostly males. So now if you combine everything that I told you together, things start making sense. Because what happens is that there is increased demand for educated workers in both sectors, in both occupations, clerical workers and skilled and unskilled workers. Now, the clerical workers are mostly females. We know that there is increasing supply of females in the labor market, and especially educated females. So these females find jobs as clerical workers, so their wages is increasing, but not as dramatic as in the other occupation. In the other occupation, skilled and unskilled workers, there was also an increased demand for educated workers, but these are normally males. But the supply of educated males is not increasing as much as educated females. So these occupations are not easily filled by appropriate workers. Therefore, the wage is increasing even faster. So what I tried to show you is that it all makes sense. I mean, the statistics make sense. It seems that there is a supply and demand framework going on in the Israeli labor market. The main differences between educated and non-educated workers, and the wage increases or the differential wage increase can be easily explained by these differential demand for different types of education. So to summarize and give some policy interpretation of the findings that I've just shown you, first of all, I hope I convinced you that much of income inequality in Israel is coming out of the labor market. We've seen that both employment and wages are vary mostly by the level of education, which puts education as the key challenge to improving things in the labor market. That's especially for women, especially for minority women, for Arab women, and especially among the older men. So the older men who are less educated are not able to maintain their employment as they age. So that's a challenge for policymakers, because the older workers are not going to become more educated. So you have to find short-term solutions for these workers who lose their jobs, but also think about the next generation. So in the short run, there's a bunch of active labor market policies, like Eran mentioned, employment centers and sort of, that can become effective in the short run, and I emphasize in the short run. It's going to find solutions for this generation of workers, but not necessarily for the next generation of workers. Another policy instrument that has been experimented with in Israel is earned income tax credit. The experiment turns out good, but it's very expensive now to implement throughout the society. So the government is planning to implement this. It's not clear to what extent this will be successful, but there's a big potential here to promote people that with relatively low income prospects to join the labor market and remain in the labor market. But in the long run, education, as I said, is the key. Education system has a challenge of finding solutions to inequality in the long run. So again, if you think about this supply and demand framework, so if we are able to increase faster the fraction of educated workers in the labor market, we may be able to close the gaps between educated and not educated workers. But that doesn't mean we want to make everybody get a college degree, for example. There are people, we don't need every worker in society to have a college degree, but we do need to, first of all, to make it possible for everybody who has the ability to get into the education system. So if we have any kind of barrier to gaining university education, financial barriers, cultural barriers, anything, the government should do something about that. We need that everybody who can and is able and wants to get university education will be able to do that. And the second is we have to make sure that even those who are not getting university education will get the skills that are necessary for a modern labor society, for a modern global economy. And these skills are actually changing over time, so it's quite difficult to know what's going to be the skills of the next that will be needed by the next generation of workers. But this is why I said this is a challenge, and we have to face this challenge, because this is the potential. If we speak about the next generation of workers, they are now in the education system, and what we don't do now in the education system, 20 years from now or 10 years from now, it's going to be too late. So thank you for listening. Happy day.
Thank you, Ayal. There was a huge amount of material there, and plenty of material for questions in our discussion later.